Well, I was 41, and like I said, I was a self-proclaimed athlete and a model and young, young enough and didn't have any family history. I felt kind of immune to getting cancer. Well, survivorship certainly looks different for everybody. Everybody's impact and how it's impacted them is so different. You can have the exact same disease, right? You can have lung cancer, you can have breast cancer, you can have a brain tumor. Everybody's tumor is going to be different. Everybody's emotional impact is different, and their physical impact is different. So one size does not fit all. And so, which is why it's important to have multiple stories and multiple points of view. And I think that's a subject that cancer survivors should talk about, because a lot of times when treatment is over, or the perceived treatment is over, people go away and they move on with their lives, which is expected. I'm not saying it's wrong, but people need to know that there are people out there going, are you doing okay? Are you checking on them, right? Just a text. Doesn't have to cost money. Doesn't have to cost you your resources or your time. As survivors or patients, we can teach the world, right? How to care for the ones that come after us. And that's our responsibility. So I take that very seriously. And so when I talk about survivorship, it looks different for me. And so I don't want to alienate people by me saying, well, this is how I've survived, and this is how, I try to teach people to survive. It doesn't necessarily fit other people. I try to look at it as a thriving. I try to look at it as I haven't just survived. I don't want to just be a survivor. I want to be a thriver. And for me, that looks like giving back to the community on all levels. And so if that costs me something, if that costs me some emotional distress, right? By sharing my story, if that costs me some financial distress, that's okay for me. Because I know that when I was diagnosed, I felt like I was alone. I felt like I was alone in the diagnosis. I felt like I was alone in the journey, not because I didn't have friends and family there. I did. But again, if you don't have contemporaries that have gone through it, you don't really know. And so for me, thriving is helping to give people hope, because I'm living a story of hope. But also, again, talking about the pain and the complications and why it's so important to have these conversations. But I also talk to breast cancer survivors who will say to me, today was the day of my diagnosis 2 years ago, and I can't get out of bed. And surviving is ultimately getting out of bed. And I'll say that you don't have to do anything, but just try to get out of bed. And that's enough. And so I think one of the most important things that we collectively can do as survivors and as a community of people trying to help cancer patients is to just try to teach grace. Try to say, whatever the baby step, take baby steps. Give yourself enough grace today to get through the day, even if it looks bad. Give yourself enough grace today to forgive yourself if you're angry, to forgive yourself if you're mistrusting of doctors, right? That's okay. And so when we give ourselves a grace and we show grace and we teach grace, that ultimately builds up our courage, right? Because if I get mad at myself and say, well, you know what, I shouldn't have been rude to that nurse. Well, okay, I'm having a bad day. And if I'm rude to the nurse, I can certainly go back and apologize to that nurse and say, I'm sorry, this is my issue, not yours. That's grace. And we all make mistakes like that, and that's okay. And so if you give yourself the grace, then you're giving yourself the courage. And then you're building your self-esteem. And then you've got your feet on the ground. And now you're on level ground. Now you're not staying in bed. And so I think survivorship looks different. But if we talk about it and we give each other grace, I think that's a really good talking point. And that's where we should start. Well, I also think that for me, when I was diagnosed, I thought, it was so overwhelming. This is going to go on forever. Like, it's just so much. I just couldn't, just so much. I'm always going to have this now. I'm never going to be who I was before. It's always going to be this scarlet letter or whatever however you want to label it. In my opinion, in my mind, that's how I labeled it, which is a terrible way to label it. I would never label it like that anymore. But I felt like I was changed forever. Now, looking back, it was a season of my life. And if we can look at it as a season of your life, it looks very different. And maybe I wouldn't have been so overwhelmed, because I would have been like, okay, it's a season. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when it's over, there's a different season. And so if you can just compartmentalize it like that, it's less overwhelming. It's less grandiose. It's less big, right? We have to just, all we can do is today. We can't do tomorrow. We can't do next year. Doing those types of things keeps us present and not afraid. If you think about the magnitude of 28 rounds of chemo, and I'm on number 1, and I'm focused on 28, how am I going to get to 28? All that does is promote anxiety and fear and a low self-esteem. If I was going to number 1, I'd say, I got to get through number 1. I got to get through today. And we'll worry about next week. Now, that's not easy to do. But if you keep reminding yourself this is a season, that will help you get there. I think you have to get rid of the outcome. And what I mean by that is, when I was diagnosed with cancer, I asked a friend's mother who had been diagnosed, I said, when do you stop being afraid? And she was 10 years out. And she said, I'll let you know. And I thought, yikes, that's going to be a long time. I don't really want it to be that long. I want to get over this quicker. And so I figured out a way to stop worrying about the outcome. I had no idea in chemotherapy whether I was going to live or die. And when I was so fixated on, well, what if I die? Then who's going to have the privilege of taking care of my kids? That's just anger, right? That's fear, and that's anger. And fear translates into anger. And so when I said to myself, okay, enough of the anger, enough of the fear, don't worry about it. Yeah, just have faith. And just show courage today. Show courage for yourself. And then that may permeate to your children. That may permeate to your environment or in your community. And so when I really practiced letting go of the outcome, because in the beginning, I was like, oh, I can't let this go. I need to know if I'm going to live. But when I practiced it day after day after day after day, I finally said, okay, it's out of my hands. I cannot control whether I'm going to live or die. I cannot control whether I'm going to get cancer back. So why am I fixated on this fear? And I had to figure that out inside. And once I figured it out, I let it go. I don't ever think about getting it back. And people ask me that all the time in interviews. They're like, well, how often are you afraid? I'm not afraid. And the reason is I let go of the outcome. I'm fixated on faith. My measure is not of this world. And that's how I live my life. The outcome is one issue, but also showing courage and showing compassion and showing grace for myself. Although I was showing people courage, I was super mad inside. And I thought, wow, this is a really double standard, because I'm showing people that I'm hopeful and I'm nice to the nurses and I'm nice to my friends when they show up. But man, I was mad, and I was questioning my faith. I was questioning my life. I was questioning, like, why was I a model? Why do I feel sad that I lost my beauty? Like, why was that important to me? Why am I so fixated on the fear? Why am I so worried about getting through this and getting in the future? And so I really had to come up with a plan for me. But in the beginning, somebody said to me, people are watching you. Be very careful how you show this journey. I got that from somebody who said to me in the very beginning, people are watching. Because the truth is, I'm not talking about social media. I wasn't even on social media back then. I'm talking about every single day, people are watching you. They're watching you, how you react. They're watching you, how you live your life, right? It's just human nature. And so people were watching me, how I was responding to the diagnosis, how I was responding to the trauma. Was I responding from faith? Was I responding out of fear? And I wanted to have a legacy, even if it was just in my own family, that I wanted to respond out of grace. I wanted to respond out of faith. And ultimately that permeated, right? And so if I could teach one person to how you respond is all that really matters. Then I was, helping myself ultimately. Well, I also think it's really important who you surround yourself with. And I know people have heard that, but really take inventory, especially during cancer and diagnosis. And if there are people that are just not a part of your team, it's okay. They don't maybe know how to act. They don't maybe understand the magnitude. And so it's okay to let those people go. And they may be in your life in a different season, but maybe not this one. And so when I gave my certain friends that grace to kind of let go, that softened my heart. And that helped me not judge them. And it also helped me not compare, right? I think we need to focus on collaboration and not comparison in general. But in particular, when you're going through a diagnosis, because it's not fair to expect people to just say the right things and to be there how you want them to be there without asking for it. So I think that goes back to, again, the grace, and also the grace of other people just saying, okay, you may not be here in the season, but I need people who are just going to cheer me on. And maybe I'll say one more thing about courage. It's okay to borrow courage from other people. And what I mean by that is, like, when I got out of the hospital after my MRSA infection, well, I take it back. When I was in the hospital, it was June of 2020. There was nobody allowed in the hospital other than COVID patients. There was no elective surgeries. So if you were in the hospital of June of 2020, you were very sick. And so I had an emergency surgery to excavate my breast cavity for the, 8th, 9th, 10th time. So I had like 104 fever, and I had this MRSA infection. They were taking me into surgery, and this nurse put these papers in front of me, and I kind of lifted my head, even though it was hard to lift my head because I was so ill, to write down my signature. And I looked at it, and it said mastectomy left side. And I looked at her and I said, I can't be having a mastectomy. I've had mastectomies in 2012. She goes, it's just for insurance reasons. Here's the problem with that. That's a label. I'm basically signing a label of me having a mastectomy, which it's not true. And so anyway, that's a side note. So I'm being wheeled back, and I have no idea what the outcome is going to be. I have no idea that my whole chest is about to be excavated. And they don't know what's going to happen inside. They don't know how big the infection is. And so I come out of the surgery the next morning, the doctors come in and they take off the dress. Well, they're about to take off the dressings on my chest. And they say, you want to look at it? And of course, we all have masks on. Again, it's June of 2020, right after COVID started. And I don't really want to show them how afraid I was. And so I say to them, I don't want to see it until I'm with somebody that I love. I didn't want them to unveil what I was about to experience, probably for the rest of my life, without somebody's courage that I could borrow. I needed my mother's courage. I needed my father's courage. I needed my son's courage. I didn't have any courage right then. It was a very lonely and depleting stage of my life. And so when I talk about courage, I'm not saying that I always have the courage, even with a strong self-esteem. But what I'm saying is it's okay to borrow from other people, and even use that language. Just say, hey, Mom, I need to borrow some courage right now because I have nothing left. And I think that's so important when you go through trauma and duress, to remember it's not always just on you. And there are people out there that will lend you their courage.